Hello, welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army. My name is Liz Maurer, and today we're going to explore a revolutionary journey. Martha Washington goes to camp. As the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies deteriorated over issues of local control and representation, colonial leaders compared grievances. George Washington's compatriots selected him as one of Virginia's representatives to the Second Continental Congress. In 1775, the Congress, meeting at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, learned that British troops were crossing the Atlantic to suppress rebellious Americans. In response, New England colonies raised thousands of militiamen to meet them. Congress, at the urging of John and Samuel Adams, adopted the New England forces as a Continental Army. John Adams nominated Washington as the obvious choice to be its commander-in-chief. Obvious because Washington signaled silent support for armed resistance by attending congressional meetings in the blue and buff uniform of the Fairfax County Militia. Washington had the inestimable advantage of fully looking the part of a military leader. As Benjamin Rush stated, he has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people. On Friday morning, June 16, 1775, John Hancock officially announced that George Washington had been chosen General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. "Mr. President," he said, "though I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desires it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service for the support of the glorious cause." And on June 14th, Congress officially took charge of the troops in Boston, giving birth to the Continental Army. Washington then has to prepare to assume command. What is going to be his most difficult challenge? Writing home to Martha, whom he affectionately called Patsy. And in this letter, one of the two surviving letters between Washington and Mrs. Washington, he writes, "My dearest, I am now set down to write to you on a subject which fills me with inexpressible concern. It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care, and that it is necessary for me to proceed immediately to Boston to take upon me the command of it. You may believe me, my dear Patsy, when I assure you that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a consciousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity, and that I should enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad if my stay was to be 7 times 7 years." So of the surely hundreds of letters George and Martha exchanged, this is one of the only two to survive, because Martha destroyed their personal correspondence after George Washington's death. And this letter alludes to their deep and abiding affection for one another. Okay. On the very same day that Washington wrote his stepson Jackie Custis of his appointment, telling him that "my great concern upon this occasion is the thoughts of leaving your mother under the uneasiness which I know this affair will throw her into." Martha was in a vulnerable state, having recently lost her teenage daughter Nellie and her son Jackie having married. The same day that Washington wrote to his stepson and to Martha, he also wrote to his brother-in-law, Burrell Bassett, and asked whether Burrell and Martha's favorite sister, Anna Maria, could visit Mount Vernon or take Martha to live in their home. Although he'd assured Martha that he would return safe to you in the fall, he now told Bassett much more candidly that I have no expectation of returning till winter and feel great uneasiness at Martha's lonesome situation. Washington would continue to fret over Martha until they were reunited. In this map of Boston, Massachusetts, we can see that Washington arrived at Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 2nd, where he assumed control of the Continental Army, which had laid siege to Boston in mid-July. Washington established his headquarters in Tory John Vassall's abandoned but yet very elegant country home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Once ensconced at Cambridge, Washington worried continually for Martha's safety back in Virginia. In August, he wrote to Lund Washington, the nephew he left in charge at home, and he sought reassurance. Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had fled Williamsburg in the dead of night and taken refuge on a ship in the James River, threatening to lead an army to retake control of the colony. Rumors had reached Washington that Dunmore might raid Mount Vernon and capture Martha as a hostage to end Washington's participation in the rebellion. Lund Washington would write on October 5th, 1775, to George, "'Tis true that many people have made a stir about Mrs. Washington's continuing at Mount Vernon, but I cannot think her in any sort of danger. Mr. John Augustine Washington, the general's brother, wrote to her pressing her to leave Mount Vernon. She does not believe herself in danger, and nor do I. Without they attempt to take her in the dead of night, they would fail, for 10 minutes' notice would be sufficient for her to get out of the way. Colonel Bassett thinks her in no danger. She sets off next week with her son and daughter-in-law down to the country." So Washington's return letters really reflect his anxiety. "I could wish that my friends would endeavor to make the heavy and lonesome hours of my wife pass off as smoothly as possible, for her situation gives me many a painful moment," he confesses to his brother Samuel. To assuage his concern for her physical safety, Martha went to visit the Bassetts in New Kent County, outside of Williamsburg. By fall, Washington had determined to entreat Martha to join him at winter camp. He asked Lund to send Martha under Jackie and Jackie's wife's Nellie's care. This threw Lund into a state of panic, Martha being away from home at the time. So Lund frantically writes to Martha, begging her to return quickly so that she may make the journey before winter weather closed the roads. Martha returns at her own pace and further discombobulates Lund by taking her own sweet time in packing. And this image is of one of the trunks that Martha took with her on her several journeys to winter camps. So Martha and her entourage left Mount Vernon on November 16th. Prior to the journey, Martha had never been north of Alexandria, Virginia. It was the first step of a journey to becoming one of the best traveled women in America. Martha was surprised during her journey north to find that she was becoming, in her own words, a very great somebody. George Washington wrote to his former secretary, Colonel Joseph Reed, in Philadelphia to greet her and assist the final stage to Massachusetts. Reed exceeded expectations by welcoming Martha to the city with a military escort. The November 22nd, 1775 Philadelphia Gazette described Martha's arrival this way: "Yesterday, the lady of His Excellency General Washington arrived here upon her way to New England. She was met at the lower ferry by the officers of the different battalions, the troop of light horse and the light infantry of the 2nd Battalion, who escorted her into the city." On this map, we can see details of Cambridge. Martha arrived at Cambridge on December 11th, 1775, and she wrote to her friend Elizabeth Ramsay, back in Alexandria, saying, I did not reach Philadelphia till the Tuesday after I left home. We were so attended, and the gentlemen so kind, that I am laid under obligations to them that I shall not forget soon. I don't doubt but you have seen the figure of our arrival made in the Philadelphia paper, and I left it in as great pomp as if I had been a very great somebody. This is a picture of the Vassal House. When Martha arrived in Massachusetts, she took over running the general's household and entertaining his many guests. However, her real role was to provide unconditional emotional support to George. Leadership isolated Washington, with the stress taking a visible toll. A naturally reticent man, he had no outlet for his stress and no one with whom he could freely be himself. Martha had always fulfilled that role. One observer wrote, "I pity our good general, who has a greater burden on his shoulders and more difficulties to struggle with than I think should fall to the share of so good a man." No man, I believe, ever had a greater choice of difficulties and less means to extricate himself from them, Washington confided to his brother Jack, expressing to his family that stress was real. He later wrote to Joseph Reed, "Could I have foreseen what I have and am like to experience? No consideration upon earth should have induced me to accept this command." Mercy Warren saw how Martha's gentle affability could soften the hours of private life or sweeten the cares of the hero and smooth the rugged pains of war. Because Martha understood the importance of focusing on her husband's fears rather than her own. She wrote to her friend, "Some days we have a number of cannon and shells from Boston and Bunker's Hill, but it does not seem to surprise anyone but me. I confess I shudder every time I hear the sound of a gun. To me that never see anything of war, the preparations are very terrible indeed, but I endeavor to keep my fears to myself as well I can." Martha remained in Cambridge until early April. She returned south to Philadelphia and then proceeded from Philadelphia to New York. This is a picture of Richmond Hill. Washington moves from Boston to New York, arriving on April 13, 1776. He set to work at his headquarters on Lower Broadway, right beside the Battery. When Martha arrived 4 days later, on April 17th, she and her husband moved into this vacant mansion north of the city, which was the former residence of Abraham Mortier and his wife Martha. Mortier had served as the Deputy Paymaster General of British forces in America. With its wide verandas and splendid views of the Hudson River, the house stood in Lipinard's Meadows at what is now the intersection of Varick and Charlton Streets. In 1794, Aaron Burr purchased Richmond Hill. It was from this house that he left to fight his infamous duel with Alexander Hamilton. So this house has this historical refrain moving through it. Smallpox had overtaken the army, and Martha was vulnerable, having not had the disease. Very concerned for her safety, George Washington sent her to the relative safety of Philadelphia. She arrived May 23rd. She was inoculated, came down with a mild case of the disease, and soon made a recovery. To make their separation more tolerable, she asked Charles Willson Peale to execute a miniature watercolor of her husband, clad in his blue uniform and gold epaulets. She returned to Mount Vernon when she was well enough to travel. Washington's 1776 campaign season lasted well into the winter months of 1777. These days witnessed morale-building victories with successes at the battles of Trenton in late 76 and Princeton in January 1777. He was late getting into winter quarters, and he selected Morristown, New Jersey, staying from January until May of 1777. But Washington these days longed for Martha's company, and he was starved for news of home. For months, he had stopped corresponding with friends and family in Virginia. As he told Robert Morris, finding it incompatible with my public business. A letter or two from my family are regularly sent by the post, but very irregularly received, which is rather mortifying, as it deprives me of the consolation of hearing from home on domestic matters. With his heart in Mount Vernon and the war now threatening to drag on forever, he complained that nobody suffers more by an absence from home than myself. Martha was not able to travel across a snow-bound landscape, and she would not arrive at George's side until nearly spring. George Washington weathered the winter's stern rigors only to buckle beneath a 10-day illness in early March that left him so weakened that he dealt only with the most essential business. His aides expressed very much worrying concern, wishing that Martha would arrive soon to take care of him. She does arrive at the Morristown camp on March 14th. So Martha's arrival is going to signal the commencement of this brief social season that's going to enliven the stress and tedium of camp life. So other American officers took the signal to import their wives to camp. The Washingtons were joined by Lucy Flucker Knox and perennial favorite Katie Green. Mrs. Martha Dangerfield Bland, in a letter written to her sister-in-law from Morristown on May 12th, says, "Now, let me speak of our noble and agreeable commander, for he commands both sexes. We visit them, the Washingtons, twice or three times a week by particular invitation. Every day, frequently, from inclination, he is generally busy in the forenoon, but from dinner till night he is free for all company. His worthy lady seems to be in perfect felicity while she is by the side of her old man, as she calls him." A number of local ladies took the opportunity to visit with the Washingtons, and their recollections came down to us through their post-war reminiscences. And in reading this picture emerges of Martha as a charming hostess, always endeavoring to make her guests comfortable and keeping them entertained. But we also see a picture of a woman who understands that she was a political wife, maintaining appearances such as knitting for the cause and facilitating relationships. Right? The Army will break camp on May 28, 1777, drawing the first Morristown winter to a close. Washington entered the campaign season, and Martha returns home to Mount Vernon. Time passes, and the Washingtons' next reunion would be in Pennsylvania. The Army marched into Valley Forge on December 19, 1777. They were once again late to winter quarters, and Washington urged the Army to quickly get under cover, offering prizes to companies who built the huts the fastest or the most efficiently. With more than 12,000 soldiers and 400 women and children following behind, Valley Forge instantly became the fourth largest city in America. This is the Isaac Potts House, and Washington selected this house for his winter headquarters. It was a compact two-story stone mill house. So compact, in fact, that Washington's aides slept all crowded together on the floor downstairs, and he built a log cabin next door as a kind of makeshift dining room. And it was to this house that Martha arrived at the beginning of February 1778. The household included a mixture of enslaved individuals and paid servants. Married couple Hannah and Isaac Till worked as cooks. Hannah Till had a talent for pastry, so much of a talent, in fact, that word of her expertise has trickled down to us 250 years later today. The Washingtons rented the Tills' labor from their owners. Both were allowed to and subsequently purchased their freedom later in 1778, and both remained with Washington throughout the war as paid employees. In addition to the Tills, other members of the household included Elizabeth Thompson, who was an Irish immigrant. She was in her 70s, and she had been with Washington since New York, working as his housekeeper. George Washington made the grave mistake of letting Elizabeth go at Morristown, and Martha ensured that he brought her back. On May 1st, 1777, General Washington wrote to an aide that Mrs. Washington wishes I had mentioned my intentions of parting with the old woman before her. She is much in want of a housekeeper. Washington's household staff averaged about 24 people throughout the course of the war, and they went wherever he went. The conditions at Valley Forge were among the most challenging of the war, and though the winter itself was not the coldest, it wasn't the longest, the suffering was pretty extreme. So resources like food and firewood were quickly expended. Disease spread rampantly, with more than 2,000 people dying over only a few months. Concentrating so many people in a compact area was not a mistake that Washington would make in the future. While they were at Valley Forge, Martha organized sewing and knitting circles to provide clothing for the troops, and she visited the sick. Benjamin Lossing, Martha's 1886 biographer, claimed that he spoke to Mrs. Westlake, who knew Martha when Mrs. Westlake was a teenager living near Valley Forge. And she said, "I never in my life knew a woman so busy from early morning until late at night as was Lady Washington, providing comforts for the sick soldiers, and every day excepting Sunday, the wives of the officers in camp, and sometimes other women, were invited to assist her in knitting socks, patching garments, and making shirts for the poor soldiers where material could be procured. And every day she came to be seen with basket in hand, single attendant, going among the keenest and most needy sufferers and giving all the comforts to them in her power." During the same winter, Pierre Etienne du Ponceau, who was secretary to Baron von Steuben, said, "In the midst of all our distress, there were some bright sides of the picture which Valley Forge exhibited. Mrs. Washington had the courage to follow her husband to that dismal abode. Her presence inspired fortitude." And there are numerous quotations, people who are writing letters, having experienced this at Valley Forge, that have come down to us through time. This is the Marquis de Lafayette, because it was also at Valley Forge where a young French aristocrat met Martha for the very first time. And Lafayette described Martha as a modest and respectable person who loves her husband madly. Martha met these obligations carrying her own burdens. Anna Maria Bassett, Martha's younger sister and very best friend, died right before Christmas in 1777, and death was a constant factor in Martha's life. Before she was 50 years old, she lost her beloved father, her first husband, 5 siblings, 3 of her 4 children, and a grandchild. But Martha persevered for her husband's sake. When she arrived at Valley Forge, she was distressed by Washington's condition. She wrote to her friend, "The general is well, but much worn with fatigue and anxiety. I never knew him to be so anxious as now." And Martha's response was to create distractions. She arranged a party that February to celebrate Washington's 46th birthday. A fife and drum corps provided entertainment, and the junior officers staged Washington's very favorite play, Cato. Martha left camp in early June of 1778. The Washingtons would not see each other again until they met in Philadelphia before proceeding to the next winter camp from 1778 to 1779. This is the John Wallace House. Washington brought the army to winter quarters at the end of 1778 in Middlebrook, New Jersey, west of Staten Island, and he settled into Philadelphia merchant John Wallace's country home on the Raritan River. It was 4 miles west of Bound Brook, and he shared the family's quarters with them. John Wallace continued to live in the house with his wife Mary, his mother-in-law Mary Maddox, his youngest son William, and an unknown number of enslaved individuals. So George Washington, the man who promised his wife Martha in 1775 that his absence from home would be short, could not see an end in sight. He wrote to his brother Jack, "I'm beginning to throw the troops into their winter quarters, giving up all idea this fourth winter of seeing my home and friends, as I shall have full employment during the winter to prepare for the campaign that follows it." 11 days later, on December 23, 1778, Washington traveled to Philadelphia with General Nathanael Greene to confer with Congress. He had made prior arrangements for Martha to meet him in Philadelphia, where, indeed, she had been waiting since late November. And it was in Philadelphia that they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary on January 6, 1779, as guests of Henry Lawrence, who was president of Congress. And he was living in the John Lawrence House on the northeast corner of Chestnut and 6th Streets, which was nearly opposite the State House. Right? That house no longer survives, but you can see that intersection if you look at contemporary maps. Washington and Greene were really put off by this sort of unceasing round of parties and balls that were hosted by the city's gentry. It stood in sharp contrast to the adverse conditions that were being experienced by the troops in their winter quarters. Greene was especially disgusted, and he wrote that he was obliged to rise early and go on a round of calls and complete them. And then he complained you had to prepare for dinner and go to a round of evening balls, which would fully engage your time until 1 or 2 in the morning. After leaving Philadelphia, Washington returned to the Wallace House in February 1779 with Martha. They brought with them a set of china purchased in Philadelphia. Surgeon James Thatcher wrote of one of the dinners he attended, "The table was elegantly furnished and the provisions ample, but not abounding in superfluities. In conversation, His Excellency's expressive countenance is peculiarly interesting and pleasing. A placid smile is frequently observed on his lips, but a loud laugh, it is said, seldom, if ever, escapes him. He is polite and attentive to each individual at table and retires after the compliments of a few glasses. Mrs. Washington continues in an uncommon degree great dignity of manner with the most pleasing affability, but possesses no striking mark of beauty." Camp will break on June 3, 1779, and Washington, upon his departure, paid John Wallace $1,000 for the use of his house and furniture. Life returned to normal for the Wallace family, and Martha returned to Mount Vernon. This is a map of the area between Philadelphia and Staten Island. In the winter of 1779 and 80 saw Washington return to Morristown, New Jersey, and the town's location between Philadelphia and New York held very much strategic advantage for the Continental Army, because between December 1779 and June 1780, Washington's second encampment is established in a 1,500-acre meadow of forest and forest land named Jockey Hollow. This time, Washington rented the widow Theodosia Ford's house. Though much larger than the Wallace house, his company was again forced to share with the residents. Mrs. Ford retained 2 of the 4 downstairs rooms for her own use, constricting the general's large household. And as at Valley Forge, Washington would build an adjoining log cabin. It was the kitchen, though, that saw the most contention. Washington wrote, "I've been at my present quarters since the 1st day of December," very irritably, "and I have not a kitchen to cook a dinner in." His retinue of 18 servants and all of Mrs. Ford's are crowded together in her kitchen, and scarce one of them able to speak for the colds that they have caught. So very crowded conditions indeed. Martha joined her husband on New Year's Eve. Her travels were encumbered by bad weather, and she was trapped in Philadelphia for a period. Eventually, Washington, so desperate for her company, sent Major Gibbs, the commander of his guards, to retrieve her from Philadelphia by horse-drawn sleigh. This is a portrait of Alexander Hamilton. An aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, was increasingly discontented with his official duties, chafing for a field commission, and he was at camp. Distraction was provided by his future wife, Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of General Philip Schuyler, a frequent visitor to headquarters and new favorite of Martha Washington. Eliza returned Martha's affection. She was quite short, a plump little woman with dark brown eyes, her hair a little frosty, and very plainly dressed for such a grand lady as I considered her. She was always my ideal of a true woman, and playing matchmaker was a favorite hobby for Martha. Martha retains herself at camp through the winter, and later on, the Hamiltons become a married couple. This is New Windsor. Washington brought the army to winter quarters in New Windsor, New York in December 1780. And while George Washington wrote many letters from New Windsor, he didn't exactly specify the house in which he was actually situated. While some have identified Colonel Thomas Ellison's stone mansion, the park authority that owns this house and grounds says it was only General Knox's headquarters, not Washington. But it's the only house that we have. Right? Martha arrived at some place in New Windsor on December 15th, 1780. Okay. This is a miniature of Martha's daughter Patsy. Martha held family very dear. Throughout her marriages, she had several portraits painted of her family members. And today, if you were to visit Mount Vernon, you could see them throughout the mansion, or you can view them on the website. In this particular year, Martha carried her 3 most precious portraits to camp with her. She wrote to Charles Willson Peale on December 26, 1780, requesting that he set her miniatures into a bracelet. She told him, "I send my miniature pictures to you and request the favor of you to get them set for me. I would have them for bracelets to wear round the wrists. I would like to have them set neat and plain, and I will be much obliged to you to hurry the person that undertakes the doing of them, as I am very anxious to get them soon." The portraits that she sent to Peale were the miniatures of her 2 children, Jackie and Patsy, that he had painted in 1772 on a visit to Mount Vernon, and the miniature of George Washington that she had commissioned in 1776. In the spring of 1781 was not kind to Martha. She was frequently laid low by a series of bilious disorders and colic, as George Washington described them to the people he was writing letters to. He wrote to his son-in-law, John Parke Custis, "Dear Custis, Mrs. Washington very unwell, as she had been for 4 or 6 days preceding, and still continues. Her complaint was in the stomach, bilious, and now turned to a kind of jaundice, but she is better than she has been, though still weak and low." And he was, of course, very concerned about her health, though not concerned that she was in serious ongoing danger. Washington's letter failed to meet its intended recipient. Instead, British patrols intercepted it and other correspondence and forwarded that letter to Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton disclosed the contents of that letter to Mrs. Martha Mortier. You'll remember Mrs. Mortier, who was the prior resident of New York's Richmond Hill House. So she sent a box of items good for invalids, as she said, under a flag of truce, along with hopes for Mrs. Washington's speedy recovery. The items that she sent included lemons, oranges, 4 boxes of sweetmeats, a keg of tamarinds, which was a medicinal seed that you could make a syrup from. There were 200 limes. There were 24 orgeats. There was 24 pineapples and 2 pounds of hyson tea. Washington was beside himself in anger at having these things arrive in camp. and always sensitive to appearances, he refused to accept them, turned them around, and sent them right back, including a note on Martha's behalf. And I love the way he so politely expresses himself. General Washington presents his compliments to Mrs. Mortier and thanks her for the very polite attention to Mrs. Washington, who has so perfectly recovered as to be able to set out for Virginia in a day or two. This being the case, General Washington hopes Mrs. Mortier will excuse his returning the several articles which she so kind a manner sent up by a flag, assuring her at the same time that he is ever her entertain a grateful sense of this mark of her benevolence. 1781 brings a glimmer of hope for military success. Washington observed that General Lord Cornwallis had made a strategic error that Washington himself had narrowly avoided. Cornwallis had led his army to Yorktown, Virginia, intending to evacuate with the Royal Navy back to New York. Now, Yorktown is situated on a narrow spit of land along the York River, and in the 18th century had a port deep enough for large sailing vessels. Washington knew that Cornwallis and his entire army could be trapped on that spit, especially if the French Navy successfully blockaded the port. And Washington and the French General Rochambeau struck out for Yorktown, aiming to visit Mount Vernon along the way. Washington arrived at Mount Vernon September 9, 1781, his first sight of home in years. His immediate goal was to plan the Yorktown siege, and Martha welcomed Washington and his entourage to their home. The French officers praised her gracious hospitality. After a short sojourn at Mount Vernon, the army continued on their way to Yorktown. This is a picture of the Eltham plantation. So while at Mount Vernon, for the very first time, Jackie Custis expressed an interest in joining Washington's military family, asking to accompany Washington as an aide. We don't know how Martha felt about that, but Jackie soon set off with the army. It was not a providential decision. Under the unsanitary conditions of an army in the field, Jackie contracted camp fever. His prognosis was poor, and Washington evacuated him 30 miles away to Jackie's uncle's home in New Kent County. Martha and Jackie's wife Nellie flew to his side. In Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered his army on October 19, 1781. On November 5th, Washington hastened to Eltham, arriving a few hours before Jackie died, 3 weeks before Jackie's 27th birthday. He was buried at Eltham. Washington took Nellie and Martha back to Mount Vernon. With operations at Yorktown under control, Washington spent several weeks at home sorting out the Custis estate and comforting his 4 grandchildren. Duty again will intrude, and the Washingtons will leave Mount Vernon on November 20th for Philadelphia. He and Martha traveled together to Philadelphia, arriving on the 26th, and they took up residence in the former home of John Penn, who was the last Loyalist governor of Pennsylvania and a member of the Penn family, namesake family for the colony. After several months in Philadelphia, playing politics during the day and socializing in the evening, the Washingtons set out for the town of Newburgh, New York, the Continental Army's new temporary home. And along the way, they revisited several of their former winter camp abodes. Arriving March 31st, 1782, they settled into a 2-story stone farmhouse atop the Hudson River. Here, they welcomed many visitors, including Mrs. Livingston and Mrs. Montgomery. The Washington would stay at the Housebrook House until August of 1783, but Martha returned to Mount Vernon in July 10, 1782. She kept the doors at Mount Vernon open to visitors. In a letter dated August 7, 1782, George Washington thanked the Comte de Custine-Serac for the Comte's visit to Mrs. Washington at Mount Vernon and the gift of elegant china. George longed to resolve the business of war, but felt trapped until the finalization of the peace treaty. As time wore on, the troops grew restive and resentful, and though he had hoped to return to Mount Vernon for the winter, Washington resigned himself to yet another winter away from home. So Martha returns to Newburgh in December. On April 15, 1783, Ensign Benjamin Herring writes to his mother that he was invited to dine with the Washingtons, and at table he placed me on the left hand of Mrs. Washington. General Washington was on her right. The company besides consisted of about 15 officers. The dinner was good, but everything was quite plain to be seen about this house. But what every officer in the army might likewise have in his, Mrs. Washington was as plain, easy, and affable as he was. One would have thought from the familiarity which prevailed there that he saw a respectable private gentleman dining at the head of his own family. So you can see from these observations and letters how easy Washington is in Martha's company and how she facilitates the company around the table and the interactions even during very stressful times. Right? Martha, unfortunately, at this time is again suffering from what George will characterize as an incompetent share of health. So she's being in and out of illness. In late August of 1783, Congress summons Washington to its temporary home in Princeton, New Jersey. Congress had fled Philadelphia after mutinous troops from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, brandishing weapons, stormed into the city, demanding back pay. So the Washingtons moved into Rockingham, a farmhouse in Rocky Hill, a few miles outside of Princeton, where Washington planned to stay until the definitive peace treaty, whenever that would arrive. Martha stayed until early October, when her health allowed her to travel. On October 31st, Congress in Washington received word of the end of the war, and on November 2nd, Washington composed his farewell orders to the armies of the United States at Rockingham, a document dismissing his troops and announcing his retirement from the army. So this restful time for Washington peeled away layers of tension built up during the stressful war years. One day he threw a dinner for Congress in a grand trophy of the war, a big tent captured from the British, and his guests delighted in his newfound calm. "The general's front is uncommonly open and pleasant," said David Howell of Rhode Island. "The contracted, pensive face, betokening deep thought and much care, is done away, and a pleasant smile and sparkling vivacity of wit and humor succeeds." So this dinner afforded a rare vignette of Washington succumbing to a merry mood. When the President of Congress regretted that Robert Morris had his hands full, Washington retorted, "I wish he had his pockets full." Right? Washington is then going to resign his commission. He departs Rockingham in November 1783. On December 23rd, he resigned that commission to Congress assembled in Annapolis, Maryland. And Martha welcomed him home on Christmas Eve, 1783. On December 28th, he composed his first letter from home proclaiming to New York Governor George Clinton, "I am now a private citizen on the banks of the Potomac. I feel myself eased of a load of public care, and I hope to spend the remainder of my days in cultivating the affections of good men and the practice of domestic virtue." This is a portrait of the Washington family. By the end of the war, the woman who in 1775 had shuddered in fright at cannon blasts was enchanted by the sight of well-drilled units and thrilled to the lilt of fife and drums. One post-war visitor to Mount Vernon, a young Scotsman named Robert Hunter, heard an earful from Martha Washington about the Continental Army's crisp efficiency. "It's astonishing with what raptures Mrs. Washington spoke about the discipline of the army, the excellent order they were in, superior to any troops," she said, "upon the face of the earth," towards the close of the war. Martha never forgot the heavenly sight of the troops in those closing weeks. Almost every soldier shed a tear at parting with the general when the army was disbanded, she told Hunter, calling it a most melancholy sight. Martha Washington, steadfastly loyal to the cause and to its leadership, established herself as a political wife, a Republican mother, and an icon for a new nation.